This pattern is for a woven non-stretch material. We recommend a viscose or rayon as it has a beautiful drape which is especially needed in the front tie of the dress. Make sure that you pre-wash and iron before you start cutting out to avoid a shrinkage situation, which is just never great. And check out the size chart for this pattern and concentrate on the bust area as the waist is elasticized so it can be cinched into however small you need it. We give back with every one of our patterns and you can check that out at maylabel.co/givingback. And if you want a link for this pattern or you want to see how to assemble our patterns, then you can check out the links on the screen. After you've downloaded the pattern and put it together, then we suggest checking out the cutting plan for meterage and how to best cut out the pattern. So each individual pattern piece will tell you the name of the pattern, how to cut it, and how many to cut, and where to place it on the material in terms of your grain line. So if your pattern piece says to place on fold, then you need to fold your material in half in line with the lengthwise grain or warp, and then pop your place on fold line on the folded edge and weigh down your pattern piece. We like to use a rotary cutter because it's super easy to cut out and you get a lot less movement in the pattern piece. And then once you open it out, you'll see that you have two symmetrical sides. There are little labels which we like to add onto each pattern piece just so you know exactly what's what when everything is cut out. The other cutting method you'll see on the pattern is called a mirror cut. It's when you flip the pattern to be the wrong side up and it will give you a mirror image of that pattern. The other way you can do that is to also fold the fabric in half. Make sure that you do keep in mind the selvage edge. For this, you can cut the entire way around the pattern piece and you don't need to worry about a fold line. Keep in mind when you are mirror cutting pieces that if you have only a little bit of fabric and you're sticking to the cutting plan, you may need to cut them separately. Using a friction pen, mark the notch on your sleeve and also which side is the front. We also suggest that you pop on a label with a little F on the front side in case your F with the iron off pen does get ironed off. And there you can see that the mirror cuts gives you mirror versions. Little note, just make sure that you mark the hem and seam of the frills because that can be a little bit confusing. So now we're going to assemble the top of the dress, starting with the top, front and top back panel. We're going to join the side seams with French seams that we like to call Frenchies. The reason that we do so with French seams is just because it looks way more beautiful on the inside of your garment and it really helps with the durability of it when you wash it. So you're going to pin the shoulder and the side seam with wrong sides together. Then you're going to sew a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam along all 4 seam lines. Once you've sewn your seam line, we're going to trim it back and it should be fairly close and needs to be less than 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter. Then you're going to open up the top and press all 4 of the seams flat. Once you have pressed it flat, flip it. You're going to roll the seam to the outside edge with your finger and then press it with the iron. You want that seam line to be right on the edge. You may just need to roll the seam a little bit with your fingers and then come in behind with the iron and give it a nice steam as you go. And then once you've done that to all 4 seams, we're going to sew a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 centimeter seam across all of them. And there you've got it, beautiful French seams. So we're going to finish by pressing both sides of all 4 seams. Now we're going to attach the back tie. So get your back tie section and start by just folding a 1/4 inch over, pressing it, and then rolling again another 1/4 inch and pressing it again. Then you're going to do a quick little seam along that edge. Place the back tie on top of the top panel. Line it up. Then you're going to mark where that ends and come in approximately 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters from that edge and mark again. I also use a pin to be safe, so if you're ironing, the marks don't come away. Then you're going to create a length of bias. The bias binding we are going to use to give you a really beautiful professional finish around the edge and neck of your top. So you will need a fair length, and we are also going to place it along the wave up to the tie. To make enough bias for this project, you want to cut a square with sides of 14.5 inches or 37 centimeters. Make sure that you cut the square in line with the selvage edge to make sure that you have the true bias across the diagonal. Each strip of bias should be around 1 3/8 inches wide or 3.5 centimeters. And if you're not sure how to make bias or you just need a little refresher, you can check out our lesson with the link on the screen and also linked below in the notes. You're going to get your bias tape and open one edge and place it right sides together right near the mark on your tie. You're going to want about 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch overhang from where you line up the mark. And from there, you can just continue to pin the entire way around the neckline of your top until you reach the mark on the other front panel tie of your top. Then you're going to pin the bias on the bottom wave of the top that leads up to the mark on the tie of your top. When you reach the mark, simply clip a 1/4 inch or 1 centimeter past it. So you're going to open the bias tape completely up and fold the end in that 1/4 inch that we left there. And then also fold the top down, wrapping it like a little prezi. And then you're just going to give it a good press. And do that on all 4 ends of the bias. Then we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam that lines up with this crease along all lengths of the bias. Make sure that you do have your needle lining up with that crease and then just sew the entire way around. You can move your top as you go, especially around the curved bits, and gently just feed the top through the machine. a little back stitch at all the starts and ends. We're going to remove all the pins from the bias, and then you're going to get your back tie piece, placing it on your top and pinning it in place. Then you're going to continue the bias 1/4 inch seam along the tie so that you're sewing the two pieces together. So at the sewing machine, just line up that stitch with the 1/4 inch and continue around the edge of the tie. When you reach the end point, make sure your needle is down and you can pivot so that you can sew around the curved area. Just take it nice and slowly, and you can really just move the fabric around. And if you need to, lift up the foot with the needle down and give it a little pivot just to get around those really kind of sharp corners. Sew until you reach the end of the tie and give a little back stitch. So now you can see that we've got a 1/4 inch seam that runs the whole way around. So you can take out all of your holding pins, and you're going to snip that little corner bit that's going to give us a nice pointed end of our tie. Then you're going to turn the tie inside out, and this may take a little jiggling. Then using your fingers, you can roll the edge of the tie out and also roll out those side seams. I sometimes use a blunt pen just to give the end of the tie a nice point. And then rolling the seams, just come in with the iron and press so the seam is on the outside edge of the tie. Using some tiny scissors, you just want to snip that little bit of bias up to the stitching, but just be careful that you don't nip anything else. Then we are going to fold the bias once to the seam and then roll it down again, and just making sure that all of the end bits are nicely tucked in, and then give it a pin. And you're going to continue that same method all the way up, folding the bias once to the seam line and then rolling it over again. This can be a little fiddly, but once you get the hang of it, it's actually kind of meditative. You don't need to cut all of these seams because it just gives you a little bit more durability to your top. So you just tuck them in on that first fold and then fold the fabric over again and pin. Once you've pinned the entire way around the bias, I just like to give it a quick little press, as it makes it a lot easier to sew at the machine. And then you're just going to sew right on the edge of that bias. A little sewing hack that I use when sewing bias is that I always start midway so that I can sew right off the edge of the bias. And you can see when you get to the corner, you can then just use your needle and foot to pivot, turn the fabric and sew it right off the edge. That's going to give you really nice, neat seams. And then give it a press. So now we're going to attach the frill sleeve. So we're going to press a double rolled hem around the outside of the sleeve. So you start by rolling in 1/4 inch and giving it a press. This can be a little bit fiddly, but just take your time and go nice and slowly. We're going to then fold it in again and press. A little sewing hack is if you're having a bit of trouble, that you can dampen the material, and that helps. Once it's all beautifully pressed, we're going to sew a 1/4 of an inch hem all the way around the outside of the frill sleeve. Once you've done that, give it a very good press. Then we're going to line up the front of the top with the front of the frill sleeve. The notch that you made on your pattern should line up with the shoulder seam on your top. Once it's in place, give it a pin. Then you're going to continue to pin the rest of the sleeve. You'll notice there is a gap at the bottom of the sleeve hole, and that is definitely meant to be there. Make sure the space in this gap is even. Then we're going to sew 3/8 or a 1 centimeter seam the whole way around. We're then going to trim close to that seam. It needs to be less than a 1/4 of an inch. And you're also going to continue that trimming in the gap area. Then you're going to take a piece of bias and measure it for that gap space. Where the frill meets the sleeve, you're going to leave about a 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 a centimeter that you will later fold over. Trim it. And then open up the bias and fold in that 1/4 of an inch seam and press. Do this on both sides. And then you're going to fold the bias lines back in and press them closed. This is going to give you a nice finished edge. You're going to pin the bias in that space with right sides together. You want to make sure that you're really lining up the ends so that it's going to cover that section where the frill sleeve is just going to join to the top and cover any messiness that might be there. Then you're going to sew a 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter along that bias fold line. Now we're going to go back and finish the Frenchy sleeve by pressing the seam of the sleeve and the top to the outside edge. And then you're going to finish it with a 1/4 of an inch seam or 1/2 a centimeter and press. And that is going to give you a beautiful French seam sleeve. To finish the gap section, we're going to go and roll the bias once to the sleeve and then over again, making sure that if there is anything tucking out at the edge of the sleeve, you just poke it into the bias and pin it down. Make sure that the bias is rolled all the way along the gap. And then starting halfway as a little hack, you're going to sew to the end, and then you can pivot and sew all the way out. And you should do that on both ends. Now we're going to give the sleeve and the bias a final press, giving your frill sleeve a really nice iron and pressing it inside and out, and also admiring your beautiful French seams on your sleeve. And there you've got it. You have now finished the top section of your dress. Now we're going to get sewing the skirt. So to start, you're going to attach the front and back skirt panel using a Frenchy seam. So first, sewing 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam down both sides, then trimming to less than 1/4 of an inch, opening and pressing the seam, flipping it over and really fiddling that seam to the outside edge and pressing, and then finishing with 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter seam. And finally pressing the French seam to one side. Attach the skirt to the top using an elastic casing. So start with your back skirt panel and mark 1/4 and halfway, and do the same on the top back panel of your top. We find the easiest way to do this is to actually fold your top in half and then fold it again to find the 1/4 and mark all 4 of those. Changing your stitch length to your longest setting, we're going to sew 2 basting stitches along the back part of your skirt. There should be 2 lines of basting stitches. Getting the top 2 strings, you're going to pull them and gather the material across. Then you're going to join the halfway point of your top and your skirt and even out the gather towards the 1/4 way mark and the side seam. Take extra care with the side seam, making sure it matches the whole way down. And pin across. You're then going to get the front of your top and lay it on the front of the skirt and pin it in place. You will notice there's a gap at the front, which is absolutely fine. Then we're going to sew 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter all the way along the top of the skirt. You can sew over the gap area as well. You're then going to take the top and put it inside the skirt so the wrong side is facing out. And then with scissors, very carefully trim towards that line. Then we're going to fold over 1/4 of an inch all the way around the seam and press. Once you have pressed all the way around that top seam, we're going to fold it down again and create a casing for the elastic. So make sure your elastic comfortably fits within the folded area with a little bit of space to sew a hem underneath. Then you're going to mark that width and continue to press all the way around the seam line. Pin in place to make sure that it stays firm. Once you've pressed the whole way around the seam, mark an opening and closing area for the elastic. You're then going to sew at the start of this mark as close to the edge as you feel comfortable. You're going to sew all the way to the mark where you're going to stop and make sure you do a little back stitch. Then using this opening, you're going to thread the elastic through. Pin one end of the elastic to the skirt to make sure that you don't pull it through. Then use a pin in the other end to feed the elastic through the casing. Now you may hit some sections that are going to cause the pin to get stuck. So I like to just do a little bit of unpicking, enough so that you can get in there and pull that pin through anything that's getting it jammed. And then you can continue on your way, threading the elastic through the casing until you reach the end. Pin it together and try it on to see how tight you would like the elastic. And once you have a measurement, trim it in place and pin. Now you can sew the elastic with the machine, but we find it easier to tack the elastic and then pop it back in the casing and sew on top of the elastic and the casing. Finally, close the seam hole, making sure to backstitch. And you can see your elastic is all sewn together and inside of the casing. Be sure to go back and close up any other holes that you opened during threading the casing. Then you're going to press the casing down towards the bottom of the skirt. Then you're going to sew a seam along the bottom edge of the casing. This can be a little tricky, so take your time and just give the elastic a stretch as you sew. Once you're finished, give your garment a final press on the elastic casing. And also admire your handiwork. Now we're going to sew the frill together, which can be a little bit tricky. So if you're a size 4 to 8, you're going to see that your pattern is one long piece in the front frill. If you're a size 10 to 16, to make sure that we could still cut on the selfage edge, we split the pattern piece into 3. So you're going to have a seam that joins here and here in the front frill. The back frill in all sizes will have one center seam. When joining the front and the back frill together, make sure you know which side is joining to the skirt and which side will be the hem. The frill follows the cascading style of the skirt, and it can be very easy to sew them together upside down, so just pay special attention to joining these two sections. I find it easier to batch all of the seams using the Frenchie. So pinning wrong sides together all of the edges of your frill. Then you're going to sew a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam and trim back. Then you're going to press the seam to the outside edge of all joins of your frill. And finally sew a 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter seam across all joins and press flat. You can trim any uneven edges on the bottom or hem side of the frill. Then we're going to do a double rolled hem. First, fold a 1/4 of an inch and press the whole way along the hem side. Then roll in again and press another 1/4 of an inch. You're then going to sew along the hem edge as close to the edge as you feel comfortable, and finally press to finish. Now we're going to attach the frill. Mark a 1/4 and halfway point across the front and back of your skirt and your frill. Using the longest stitch length, you're going to sew 2 lines of basting stitches along your frill. Starting at the side seam where the front and back frill meet, and making sure that you stop at the other side seam, as you want these stitches to be separate so that you can gather the front and the back of the frill separately. Pulling the top 2 strings of either the front or the back of the frill, gather the material across. Join your halfway marks and pin together. Even the gathering out until the quarter way marks match. Then you're going to pin these together. Also, make sure that your side seams are matching perfectly. Even the gather out in each section and pin in place. Join the frill to the skirt using a good old French seam. Start by sewing 3/8 of an inch or a 1 centimeter seam. Then you're going to trim the excess to less than 1/4 of an inch. Press flat. Then turn your dress and press the seam to the outside edge. Pin in place. Make sure that your seams are still lining up. Then you're going to sew 1/4 of an inch or a 1/2 centimeter seam. And press your beautiful French seam towards the bottom of the skirt. Finally, we're going to add the hook and eye closures. Try your dress on and find the top and bottom point where you want your closures to sit, and then evenly mark out the middle closure. Evenly mark the other side of the top. Place your hook on the bias, making sure that you're only tacking the top edge so it's not going to be seen on the right side. Sew the rings and the base of the hook so that it doesn't gape when clipped. Next, sew the hook. Again, only sewing the bias so it's not seen on the right side. When your hook and eye is closed, it should just meet in the middle and shouldn't gape. To tie the front, you want to gently loop one length through. It is designed to be quite a relaxed tie, so shouldn't be too tight. We have found a double tie works well with the style of the dress, so pull the loop through again.